Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, covering the great books of Western literature, we turn to an examination of the most famous Christian book of all time, St. Augustine's Confessions. Confessions is arguably Augustine's best-known work. What began as a response to Christological controversies in schismatic Christian communities in North Africa over the interpretation of Genesis 1 sprawled into a pseudo-autobiographical confession that made Augustine relatable and literarily immortal. As we know, Augustine reflects on his life of sin, his life of being indoctrinated in a perverse Roman educational system that extolled selfishness and social climbing or glory, and his struggles in Carthage, Milan, and beyond. Augustine, however, never abandoned his Virgilian pretensions and love of the great Roman epicist and poet, whom he quoted more than Plato, which is often forgotten in the historically inaccurate statement that Augustine baptized Plato. Augustine did speak highly of Plato in some places, but Plato ranked even beneath the Hebrew prophets of the Holy Scriptures and Virgil and Cicero in Augustine's voluminous writings. Just as Virgil offered poetic Odyssey, Augustine emulated Virgil in the composition of his autobiographical section of the Confessions. That, perhaps, is the grandest achievement of Augustine's classic and why it remains such a deeply moving and enduring work. We find ourselves in Augustine, our hope, our desire, our own life journey. When Augustine mused who he was, mihi quaestio factus sum, who am I, or quite literally, if you translate it out of the Latin, I have become a question to myself, we reach the fullest crystallization of Augustine's interior odyssey. But Augustine's interior pilgrimage is not divorced from his physical pilgrimage he undertakes in the Confessions. Like Aeneas, his poetic idol, crafted by his beloved poet, Augustine's spiritual journey is accompanied by a physical sojourn across the Mediterranean Sea. Reading the Confessions makes clear Augustine knew Virgil well, perhaps all too well. He even laments that he learned to weep for Dido more than his own depraved state of being. If Dante had a man-crush on Virgil, Dante was merely following the footsteps of Augustine, who had the first Christian man-crush on Rome's most sublime and grandest poet. Indeed, it can be argued that Augustine modeled his own journey in Confessions after Aeneas's journey in the Aeneid. We have an exile driven to Carthage. From Carthage, that exile manages to find his way to Rome, where he experiences a conversion of grace and happiness through a vision halfway through the work, just as Aeneas receives his theoria, his vision, in the underworld halfway through the Aeneid. The exile now becomes a member, more intimately, of a community and becomes a warrior for love, just as Aeneas becomes the warrior of love for his community of exilic Trojans as war in Italy commences for the future of civilization. From a region of destitution, Augustine journeys to a place of inexhaustible abundance, which echoes the very journey of Aeneas out of a city of destitution to a peninsula of Arcadian fragrance and abundance. As Virgil recounts in that most sublime scene in the underworld, where Aeneas looks upon the valley of Arcadia. Meanwhile, in a quiet valley, Aeneas sees a secluded grove and roaring forest thickets, and the river of Lethe rippling past many peaceful homes. In the valley danced innumerable peoples and tribes. Out in the meadows, with the blue skies of summer shining overhead, bees land and feast on many-hued blossoms and stream round lustrous flowers and lilies, and all the green pastures murmur with the buzzing and humming of life. Augustine's restless heart moves him to a place of extreme restlessness. As Augustine enters Carthage to become a professor of rhetoric as a teenager, he reminisces on the hissing and bubbling cauldron that he finds himself in. And far from rejecting the temptations of his imaginative Babylon, Augustine openly indulges his passions in that crackling frying pan of illicit loves. Describing Carthage, Augustine bluntly states that it is a, quote, region of destitution. What is unique about Augustine's description of Carthage is how he pairs the physical lusts and destitution of the city with his own spiritual lusts and destitution. The spiritual is never separated or divorced from the carnal. The two go hand in hand. Carthage, in Augustine's imagination, is a godless place, a new Babylon, Augustine implies, to tempt the godly into the infernal fires while masking this pain with the false pleasures of fleeting ecstasy. We must never forget that this is the same reality Carthage offers Aeneas when he arrives in that city in Virgil's poem. Over the course of the Confessions, we witness the progressive apotheosis of the saint from Hippo. While we remember his visions in Milan, his Neoplatonic ascent and crash, and then his famous weeping scene of conversion in the gardens of Milan when hearing the voice of the Christ child speaking to him, Tolle lege, take up and read, take up and read. What we forget, however, is that Augustine tries to climb to God while in Carthage, but fails. And he fails miserably, which is why we probably forget it. For Augustine doesn't tell us of any vision of God he had. He only tells us of his abysmal failures to ascend to God. Augustine dug himself a pit of destruction while in Carthage. Now trying to climb out of it, he weeps over his inability, as he says, "Despite my frequent efforts to climb out of it, I was the more heavily plunged back into the filth and wallowed in it." In this deep mire of darkness and falsity, Augustine has enslaved himself from God's blessedness and love that he nonetheless is still seeking. Moreover, while Monica has dreamt about Augustine and has talked to Augustine about her dreams and her prayers for her son, Augustine is otherwise alone and alienated while living in Carthage. He has contacts with the Manichaeans, this is true. He has sex with prostitutes, but all of this only serves to dig Augustine's ditch even deeper. Thus, when he attempts to climb out of it, he only manages to plunge himself back into the filth and wallow in it. Augustine also writes, "I tried to approach you, but you pushed me away so that I should taste death, for you resist the proud." Augustine's language in Carthage is deeply carnal and physical, befitting the physical destitution that the city represents in his rhetorical composition. Thus we get the infamous physical imagery of Augustine stealing from the pear or the fig tree, feeding the fruit to a pig, wallowing in the hissing and crackling oil of his lusts, and plunging into the filth of the hole he dug for himself. Tears flow from his eyes. His mother also weeps for him. In this destitute and godless place, Augustine is himself destitute and godless. His spiritual emptiness is tethered to the emptiness of Carthage. Thus, Augustine, like Aeneas, must flee Carthage to a godlier place, Italy. From Augustine's own language, he cannot approach God while in Carthage. As a godless place, as we've already said, Carthage is no region to approach the God of abundance and heavenly fragrance. As I've written before about this imagery and language constructed by Augustine in one of my essays, these failed early attempts at climbing the ladder to God fail when he is in that province of barren destitution. Devoid of truth, wallowing in spiritual darkness, and living a life according to the wicked will, Augustine's attempt to ascend to God are not only held back because of his spiritual state, they are held back because of the physical place he is sitting in. The emptiness of Carthage leads to empty attempts to ascend, whereby he falls back into the crackling and burning frying pan of his illicit loves. Carthage is not just a spiritual barrier, but also a physical barrier to his journey with God. End quote. So, Augustine must break free from that physical barrier, which doubles as a spiritual barrier. Following Augustine's stint in Carthage, he makes use of his networking to meet with imperial officials in Rome. He then journeys to Milan, the city where the great Catholic bishop and priest, St. Ambrose, resides. Between the pages, however, Augustine's flight from Carthage is to escape a woman, his mother. Readers of Virgil, of course, will find echoes of Aeneas's flight from Carthage to escape a woman, Queen Dido. While in Milan, Augustine experiences his first immortal and memorable vision, his glimpsing of the beatific vision as he slowly sheds his Manichaeanism and now finds himself in a more wholesome place than Carthage. Italy is not that region of barren destitution as Carthage was. On the contrary, it is a place teeming with life. Gardens, trees, and of course, some godly men. It is also the place where Augustine sheds his wrongful thinking and abundant sinning, which acts as a preparation for his journey to God. The 7th book of the Confessions contains 2 infamous episodes in the work: a discourse on the philosophy of good and evil, and the Neoplatonic vision, which ends with Augustine crashing spectacularly back to earth, having just glimpsed a mystical theoria. Interestingly, the movement to Augustine's encounter with God begins because he picked up some books of the Platonists, which allowed him to free himself of his Manichaean thinking. All philosophy and theology students are undoubtedly familiar with Augustine's treatment of evil. He argues that there is nothing intrinsically evil, for if there was something intrinsically evil, that would jeopardize the benevolence of God. Augustine's philosophy of evil is also a shielded theodicy, protecting God from what he would consider sacrilege and blasphemy. He goes on to argue that evil is a privation of nature, a depreciation of that which is inherently good by the virtue of its created status. Evil, thus, is located in an act of will, action, rather than anything natural or inherent. But what is often missed in Augustine's rumination on evil is how will manifests evil: lack of understanding. The entirety of the Confessions is a long-winded poetic treatise on the nature of truth. Augustine argues that humans are made for truth and love. Since God is truth and love, and humans are made in the image of God, this logically follows. Where we sin or fall short is in our misapprehension of truth and love, a misunderstanding that distorts the goodness that does, in fact, drive all human desire. And anyone who has read Augustine extensively knows that love is the appetitus invendendi, the appetite that moves all inquiry and action of the human being. This is inherently good, since God created all things good. Thus, it is only through improperly understanding nature that our will engages in evil, because misunderstanding is the precondition to the will privating goodness in the natural world. Properly speaking, one's logos must be unified with one's voluntas. Reason and will must come together in truth and love. Only after having learned this truth from the Platonists, that the body is not evil, can Augustine free himself from the shackles of Manichaean misunderstanding, which prevented him from ascending to God in Carthage. While Augustine employs a rhetorical and intellectual, indeed poetic skill in building the momentum toward his first, though distant, glimpse of the Godhead, Augustine must first begin to understand before he can proceed to see. Reason and will are united at last to offer him something more than the emptiness which has otherwise dominated his life. As he says, "I entered, and with my soul's eyes, such as it was, saw above that same eye of my soul the immutable light higher than my mind. Not the light of every day, obvious to anyone, nor a larger version of the same kind which would, as it were, have given out a much brighter light and filled everything with its magnitude." Augustine glimpses the sublime and the beautiful in this moment, the radiance of God, Christ, in his mystic ascent, begotten from his encounter with the Platonist books. Yet Augustine does not yet know Christ and his name. Thus, he is still rebuffed. Augustine here implies that Platonist theology and mysticism contains the seeds of divine truth, but lacking the divine revelation, it is not capable of actually seeing Christ and bringing one's soul into paradise. Having glimpsed paradise, however, Augustine nevertheless falls back to earth in it a weeping wreck. I found myself far from you in a region of dissimilarity, and heard as it were your voice from on high. I am the food of the fully grown. Grow, and you will feed on me. But now we know Augustine is, and still remains, a proud human being. However, unlike the stuffed-up pride of the Platonists, like Porphyry, his great Platonic interlocutor, he self-cultivated in the city of God, who would have patted themselves on the back for such a vision, Augustine finally embraces the key moment of his transformation, a moment of humility, dwelling not on how close he came to God, but how far he found himself from God. As Augustine laments, I found myself far from you. Though we might detect a trace of hidden pride in Augustine being satisfied with himself in acknowledging how far away he was, whereas the Platonists would be patting themselves on the back, thinking that they had come extremely close to God. But this vision of the mind, which is the soul, is only possible because Augustine has freed his mind from the pollution of Manichaean thought and the crud of Carthaginian mud. Again, it is important for the reader to recognize that Augustine's Odyssey is not merely spiritual and interior. It is physical and carnal. Augustine's glimpse of God comes not only after he has gained some spiritual and intellectual insight, it comes also in a place far removed from the hissing and crackling cauldrons and frying pans of Carthage. Augustine has soared up Diadema's ladder and found it lacking. I sought a way to obtain strength enough to enjoy you, but I did not find it until I embraced the mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus, who is above all things, God blessed forever, to possess my God, the humble Jesus. I was not yet humble enough. As fruitful as the Platonist books were in setting Augustine free, they were not enough to save his soul. No, the books of Plato and Plotinus may point you in the right direction, but it will take the voice of Christ in the form of a babe to finally push Augustine across the finish line in crushing and totalizing humility. Halfway through the work, in following the tradition of Virgilian poetry, and with the presence of another, Augustine finally receives his revelation of new life that will drive him toward this epic's conclusion. Augustine's final vision occurs after his conversation in the gardens of Milan, when the voice of Christ in the form of an infant cries out to him, "Tolle lege, tolle lege." Augustine listens at last and begins reading the epistle of St. Paul to the Romans. Augustine has finally swallowed the medicine of the soul he has long sought. En route back to North Africa, with Monica once again by his side, along with his friends, most notably Alypius, Augustine and Monica are no longer separated by the phantasmagoria of dreams or the literal running away from his mama. They are at last together and at peace. Let us briefly return to another point of compositional brilliance on the part of the Bishop of Hippo. In Carthage, he was alone. Even in Milan, he was alone. Augustine's loneliness and emptiness are directly tied to his spiritual alienation. Humans are made in love for love, and they are not meant to be alone. Truly, it is not good for man to be alone, as the scriptures say. Augustine, who has thus far been alone in the work, is now surrounded by the company of friends and loved ones. Love, at long last, has taken hold of Augustine. For the first time in the Confessions, Augustine is not alone or surrounded by the crowd and hissing cauldrons of lust that manifest in their raucousness the isolation that Augustine was in despite the seeming appearance of others around him. Take, for example, Augustine's stealing of the pear or the fig with his friends. When he confesses his sin, he is alone because he was, in fact, always alone. Moreover, in escaping Thegesta for Carthage and Carthage for Rome, Augustine was fleeing from the persistent presence of his loving mother, Monica. Between the lines, although Augustine was undeniably a mama's boy, he felt suffocated by her tears, prayers, and dreams. Augustine's flight to ruin, celebrity, and conversion were also motivated by his want to free himself from the presence of his mother. Yet Monica persists in her love for Augustine and tracks him down in Italy, and is with him as they journey together to Ostia in hope to return to North Africa. There, however, Monica falls ill. The mother that was always praying for Augustine and beside Augustine, was, as Augustine finally recognizes, a true conduit of love. Augustine, at long last, recognizes this. No longer alone, Augustine recounts his most brilliant vision in his mother's arms. As he says, the conversation led us toward the conclusion that the pleasure of the bodily sense, however delightful in the radiant light of this physical world, is seen by comparison with the life of eternity to not even be worth consideration. Our minds were lifted up by an ardent affection towards eternal being itself. Step by step we climbed beyond all corporeal objects, and the heaven itself, where sun, moon, and stars shed light on the earth. We ascended even further by internal reflection and dialogue and wonder at your works, and we entered into our own minds. We moved up beyond them so as to attain the region of inexhaustible abundance, where you feed Israel eternally with truth for food. There life is the wisdom by which all creatures come into being, but things which were and which will be. But wisdom itself is not brought into being, but is as it was and always will be. Furthermore, in this wisdom, there is no past and future, but only being, since it is eternal. And while we talked and panted after it, we touched it in some small degree by a moment of concentration of the heart, and we sighed and left behind us the first fruits of the Spirit, bound to the higher world as we return to the noise of our human speech, where a sentence has both a beginning and an ending. The Odyssey of Love has finally triumphed. In love with another, his mother no less, who had dreamt of their being together, Augustine finally beholds the love which had eluded him his entire life. The ascent to have a vision of life is the beatific vision, and that only occurs because Augustine has finally to understand what love is. In De Trinitate, Augustine defined the Trinity as a relations of love. In his voluminous other writings, though entailed and implied throughout the Confessions, he also had much to say on friendship. Friendship and family, Augustine would come to argue, are the first instantiations of the love of the Trinity in our life. God is love. Therefore, Augustine would eventually conclude, love is God. And love is first nurtured with our family and our friends, the two pillars of love in the world that most intimately reflect the love of the Godhead. And it was family and friends that Augustine lacked in the early parts of the Confessions. It is here in Ostia we witness the first fruit of the spirit of love that Augustine had long sought. He had wanted to love and be loved, as he said. In the arms of his mother, he ascends with her, and her with him, to that realm of inexhaustible abundance, the inexhaustible abundance of love itself. This is an odyssey we do not take alone. The journey to love is a pilgrimage that always entails others. It is not good for man to be alone. The very image of God, the image of love, is not merely beheld by Augustine and Monica. They themselves have become incarnate manifestations of the Imago Dei in the love they shared in that final moment. Augustine's Confessions begins in loneliness and lust, but ends in fellowship and love. The alienated lust that so grips Augustine's heart, like crackling oil in a frying pan, becomes a still calm spirit, producing the fruit of serenity. Love flows freely between Augustine and Monica, and between Augustine and his friends, principally Alypius, at the conclusion of the autobiographical portion of the Confessions, in a way heretofore unseen in the narrative. Confessions is a book of images, and it concludes, both in the autobiography and the spiritual commentary, Book 13, with grand imagery. What is more loving and beautiful than the flourishing of human love, especially between a mother and a son, which is itself a human manifestation of divine love that Dante would later say moves the sun and the other stars. The endurance of Augustine is that we, like him, seek and desire to be loved. Like Augustine, we too have dug ourselves holes, tried to ascend, persisted in stubborn loneliness, and only climbed out with the help of a face out of whose smile flows the love that we have always sought. Love truly does move the sun and the other stars. Dante knew his Augustine, and it was in that loving fellowship that Augustine, like Aeneas, finally saw Arcadia and the valley of life and love, eternal, with the company of others, not alone or alienated like in Carthage, not in a valley of tears, but a valley teeming with life and the dancing laughter of all creation.